My name is Eleanor. I am 32 years old. My mother asked me to erase myself the morning before my brother's wedding, and when I refused, she set in motion a series of events that would expose exactly how little my own family actually knew me. I stood in my childhood bedroom doorway holding my dress uniform, the one I'd worn for 14 years, the one with captain's bars that I'd earned through discipline and sacrifice, and I could smell the lavender sachet my grandmother had placed in the closet decades ago. That smell still meant safety to me. That smell meant someone had cared enough to protect something I loved. But before I tell you what happened, if you are new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell now because you need to see where this goes. Let me take you back to a Tuesday afternoon in early October when everything still felt like it could be managed. My apartment in Cambridge sits directly above a bakery called Margot's. The smell of fresh bread wakes me most mornings, not gradually, but completely. One moment I'm asleep, the next the scent of yeast and butter and rising dough pulls me into consciousness. I keep my dress uniform in a garment bag that I store at the back of my closet. I keep my coffee black. Most nights I'm reading military journals or operational reports until 11 p.m., sometimes later. The pilots I fly with, they know me better than my own blood family ever bothered to try. We've managed multi-million-dollar equipment together in conditions that would break most people. We've covered each other's shifts when life got hard. When one of us struggles, the others show up without being asked. That's the closest thing to genuine family I've ever fully trusted. My blood family is different territory entirely. I'm the eldest child, the one who left at 18 and didn't return the way they wanted me to. I send cards for birthdays, I attend funerals, I carry the heavy things so no one has to ask. That's been my entire function in the Hayes family for as long as I can remember. Absorb the chaos. Don't make waves. Stay invisible. Make it easy. My mother called on a Wednesday afternoon in September. I was between flights, sitting in the pilot-ready room with a coffee cooling on the desk beside me. The call came through to my personal phone, and I already knew what it would be about. My brother Thomas had announced his engagement 6 weeks earlier, and the wedding planning had consumed every conversation since. "Eleanor, hello," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she needed something. "I'm calling because we need to confirm your attendance for Thomas's wedding. It's October 20th. You'll make time, won't you?" I said yes before she finished speaking. I always say yes to her. It's a reflex I've never quite managed to break. "The ceremony is at 2 o'clock, she continued, "and the reception will be at the Ashford estate. Black tie. I'm certain Thomas will want all the details from you directly, but I wanted to ensure you had marked your calendar." I marked it. I booked the time off. I pressed my dress uniform out of habit, the same habit that made me arrive at my mother's house every Christmas, made me pay for dinner when she had financial anxieties, made me answer every phone call even when I was exhausted. I told myself this trip would be straightforward. A toast. A conversation or two with Thomas. Perhaps an awkward evening navigating my mother's particular brand of social anxiety. A drive back to Cambridge, manageable. I am exceptionally good at strategic planning. I am terrible at understanding my own family. Here's what I still can't fully comprehend about myself. I can sit completely still while chaos erupts around me. I can make tactical decisions that affect hundreds of people's safety. I can remain calm when systems fail and equipment malfunctions and everything goes wrong at 35,000 feet. But my mother's disappointed expression can make me feel like a child again, small and wrong and responsible for her unhappiness. That weekend revealed exactly what that pattern had cost me over 14 years. Being overlooked isn't sudden. It's 1,000 tiny erasures, each one so small you almost don't notice until you realize you've been disappearing for years. When I enlisted at 18, my mother told her friends I was taking time to discover my direction. The sentence carried a particular inflection, the same inflection people use when discussing a gap year or an extended spiritual retreat. Something temporary, something I would eventually outgrow. When I received my commission at 22, she didn't attend the ceremony. She had a gala scheduled 3 weeks earlier that she couldn't reschedule. The coordinator had been impossible to work with. There was simply no flexibility. When I was promoted to captain at 28, I called her immediately. I was standing in my apartment in Cambridge, the late afternoon light making everything gold, and I told her about the promotion. I waited for her response. "That's nice, Eleanor," she said. "Have you thought about what comes next?" Thomas was saying the investment firm has mentorship opportunities for people who want to transition into business. I said I was quite happy in the military. "Thank you." "Well, it's nice to have options," she replied, and then the subject changed to my cousin's house renovation, which had apparently exceeded its budget by $30,000, which was unconscionable, which led to an entire narrative about relatives I barely remembered. Over the years, I learned to stop mentioning my work. I'd describe a training exercise and watch her smile become thin and polite. I'd begin talking about a particularly complex operational challenge, and she'd suddenly remember she needed to call the florist or confirm plans with the country club. Within 6 months, I simply stopped trying. I was 26 years old at a neighborhood gathering when a woman named Patricia Fenimore asked what I did professionally. Before I could open my mouth, my mother touched her arm gently and spoke for me. "Oh, Eleanor's involved with aviation right now," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a temporary thing, you know. A way to see what else is out there. She'll settle into something more appropriate eventually. Something more stable." I heard her tell my father in the kitchen that same evening. I was upstairs folding laundry, and sound traveled perfectly through the air vent into the master bedroom. Their voices carried up clearly. "The military is such an embarrassing choice," my mother said. I could hear the genuine distress in her voice. "I don't understand why she can't find something respectable, something with better hours, something that doesn't involve." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "She's a captain now," my father said quietly. He's always been the quieter one, the one who listens more than he speaks. "That's a significant achievement, Ellen." "Achievement," my mother said, and the word sounded bitter. "Yes, well, I'm sure that will impress someone, but not anyone who matters." I stopped folding laundry. I sat on the edge of my bed in that childhood room and listened to my father go silent. He didn't argue with her. He didn't defend me. He just accepted the direction of her disappointment and let the conversation move on to something else. That was the year I was 26. I was already a captain. My father had heard the pain in my mother's voice and chosen her comfort over my dignity. I heard similar conversations at 30. By then, I'd stopped wincing. I'd learned that you cannot force someone to respect you through argument or achievement. Some people simply will not see you, no matter what you accomplish. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, and the learning had made me quieter. I became the daughter who transferred money for Mother's Day and never discussed her career. I became the daughter who asked my mother about her gardening club and her book selections. I became the daughter who listened to her anxieties about my father's retirement and the difficulty of finding good help these days. My entire family seemed perfectly content with this arrangement. Nobody asked what I actually did out there. Not my mother, not my father. Not my brother Thomas. They'd constructed a version of me in their minds, and it was easier for everyone if I simply matched that version. The strange thing is, I almost did, right up until I couldn't anymore. My brother Thomas was always the one people smiled at easily. This isn't a matter of opinion, it's simply fact. He was not more intelligent than me. He was not objectively more interesting. He was simply easier to celebrate. He attended an Ivy League school and obtained a position with a prestigious investment firm before he turned 25. He wore watches that communicated something about his trajectory. He existed in a way that made people comfortable, that confirmed their assumptions about merit and success. My mother's face brightened around him in ways it never did around me. When he called, she answered immediately. When he mentioned a problem, she mobilized to solve it. When he announced his engagement at a family dinner, she wept for hours, not the polite tears of a parent at an expected milestone, but the joyful, overwhelming tears of someone whose deepest prayers had been answered. His fiancée was named Catherine Ashford. The way my mother pronounced that name, with such reverence, such careful attention to the exact syllables, you'd think she was speaking of royalty. The Ashfords represented old wealth, the quiet kind with family names on university buildings and a country estate that had belonged to them for generations. They had summer homes, they had charitable foundations. They had the kind of uncomplicated confidence that comes from never having to prove anything to anyone. To my mother, this marriage wasn't simply about Thomas finding a partner. It represented the family finally arriving at a place it had been struggling toward her entire life. It meant transcendence. It meant escape. "We're becoming the kind of family that matters," she told me during a phone call in early September. And I noticed she said, "finally," as though the rest of us had been deliberately holding her back, as though my existence had been a burden on her social ascent. The wedding consumed her completely. Every detail became crucial. The florist had to be the one who did the Ashford annual gala. The menu had to reflect a specific aesthetic. The guest list arrangement had to position the family strategically among the Ashford relatives. I was assigned a role in this production, a minor role. Attend, smile, remain unremarkable, blend into the background. I was accustomed to that particular assignment. What surprised me was Catherine herself. When I called Thomas to congratulate him properly on the engagement, Catherine picked up the phone. She said hello, and then she said something unusual. "Eleanor, I've been hoping you'd call. Thomas has told me so much about you." I wasn't sure what he could have possibly told her, given that he barely knew anything about me at all. But Catherine turned out to be the kind of person who listens. During our conversation, she asked genuine questions about my work. Not the polite inquiries that come from social obligation, but real questions that suggested she'd actually considered what it might mean to be a military pilot. She asked about my training. She asked about the aircraft I flew. She asked what I loved about it. "There's something about knowing your crew completely," I heard myself telling her. You can't perform at that level unless you trust the people beside you absolutely. It removes a particular kind of doubt. You know they'll make the right decision, so you focus on making your own decisions correctly. There's a freedom in that kind of certainty. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like the kind of family everyone should have," she said, "the kind where people actually show up for each other." At the conversation's end, she said something that caught me completely off guard. "Thomas is lucky to have a sister like you," she said. "I can tell you're the kind of person people depend on, the kind of person who can be trusted with hard things." I didn't know how to respond. Nobody in my own family had said anything remotely similar in years. I felt the familiar sensation of being seen from outside my family for perhaps the first time, and that should have told me something important about the Ashfords, about the kind of people who had raised a daughter capable of recognizing value in a person her own mother had spent 14 years diminishing. Instead, I simply felt grateful. And then I felt guilty for feeling grateful to a stranger's kindness. To be fair to my mother, you have to understand the architecture of her fear. My grandfather returned from Korea profoundly changed. He drank heavily. He cycled through jobs with a predictability that bordered on routine. 3 months at a factory, 4 months at a warehouse, 2 months driving, then back to factory work. The family relocated every year or two, always following cheaper housing, always running from something. My mother spent her entire childhood as the perpetual new student, the girl in clothes that didn't quite fit, the girl carrying the invisible shame of instability like a contagion. She told me once, during a rare moment of vulnerability, about a third-grade teacher who displayed her shoes in front of the entire classroom. The shoes were worn through at the heel. The sole was separating from the upper. The teacher held them up and talked about the importance of proper footwear, of coming to school prepared. My mother was 8 years old. She never forgot that humiliation. She carried it forward into every decision she made as an adult. To her, the uniform my grandfather wore represented everything that had destroyed her childhood. It meant late-night arguments about bills. It meant an empty refrigerator at the end of the month. It meant a father whose anger made the house itself feel dangerous. She spent her entire life building away from it. The right zip code, the right social circles, the country club membership she could barely afford but maintained anyway. She built away from poverty like it was a fire chasing her. And then her daughter put on a uniform and walked directly back into the very thing she'd spent 40 years escaping. That's what nobody in these family conflict stories ever explains. My mother didn't hate me. She was genuinely terrified of what I represented. Every achievement I earned in the military looked to her like a descent back into poverty and shame and the fear that had shaped her entire existence. The danger, the instability, the association with struggle and uncertainty, it triggered something primal in her. I understood that on an intellectual level. Understanding something doesn't make it hurt less. Because here's the thing about being someone's fear instead of their daughter. You spend your entire life being managed, downplayed, kept in the shadows. You wait constantly to be acknowledged. You keep hoping that one day you'll finally be claimed. And no matter how composed you remain about it, some part of you keeps believing the next achievement will be the one that changes everything. I had been waiting a very long time. I just didn't realize exactly how long until that weekend forced me to count every moment. The conversation came 2 days before the wedding. I'd driven 800 miles to my mother's house and spent the evening unpacking in my childhood bedroom, the same room where I'd spent years learning to make myself small, the same room where I'd learned that my achievements meant nothing to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I was organizing my dress uniform in the closet when my mother knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. She carried an expensive sapphire dress on a hanger, the kind of dress that communicated something about taste and resources. She laid it on my bed like an offering, like a negotiation, like a peace treaty she was proposing unilaterally. "I thought you might wear this," she said carefully, as though she was suggesting something small, something without consequence. "It's your size. I had it tailored to your measurements." I looked at the dress. The fabric was beautiful, silk charmeuse, the kind that cost more per yard than I spent on groceries in a month. I looked at my mother's face. She couldn't quite meet my eyes. "The Ashfords are very particular about aesthetics," she continued, the words coming faster now, the justifications tumbling out like she'd prepared this speech carefully. "It's a black tie evening, and I just thought, given the nature of the guest list, it might be appropriate to simply wear something that coordinates with the evening's theme." Coordinates with the evening's theme. That was the phrase she used. I told her I'd planned to wear my dress uniform, that it's entirely appropriate for formal events, that military dress codes are explicitly acceptable at black tie occasions. I told her this calmly, the way you'd explain something factual to simply overlooked a detail. She shook her head before I finished speaking. "Just wear the blue dress," she said. "Please, Eleanor, for once." That phrase, "for once," landed like a stone in still water. For once. As though I spent my life making things difficult for her, as though my choices were some kind of personal rebellion against her comfort and her preferences. For once, as though asking me to erase myself was a small request, a minor concession, something I should simply do to prove I loved her. "Mom, I'm proud of what I do," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady the way I'd learned to do. "I've earned this uniform. I'm not ashamed of it." "I know you are," she said, and her voice was sad in a way that made it worse. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? You're so certain about your choices. You're so committed to this path. But other people won't understand, Eleanor. They'll judge. And I can't have that on this day. Not when Catherine's family is here. Not when Thomas is finally—" She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Finally what? Finally making her proud? Finally doing something respectable? Finally becoming the kind of son she could claim without apology? I didn't ask. I already knew the answer to that question. I'd known it since I was 26 years old, listening through an air vent to my father's quiet capitulation. "What if I wore the dress?" I asked, my voice very quiet. "Would you tell people what I do?" She didn't answer me. "Would you mention it at all?" I pressed. "Or would I still be temporarily involved with aviation? Would I still be the daughter who hasn't quite figured out what she wants to do with her life?" She looked away, and that silence was answer enough. It was the answer I'd always known I would get, but hearing it confirmed in that particular moment, in my childhood bedroom, with my grandmother's lavender sachet still scenting the closet, with my uniform hanging there like a question, something shifted inside me. Not anger, exactly. Anger is cleaner than what I felt. It was more like a settling, a recognition that I couldn't fix this by becoming smaller, quieter, more palatable. Some part of my mother's fear would exist no matter what I wore, no matter what I said, no matter how I arranged myself for her approval. I stood there in that moment and understood that I'd been waiting for her to see me for 14 years. And she wasn't going to. Not because I wasn't worthy of recognition, but because my success in the military would always feel to her like a reminder of the poverty and fear she'd spent her entire life running from. I folded the blue dress carefully. I placed it back in her hands. "I'm wearing my uniform," I said, and my voice was calm. "I'm Captain Eleanor Hayes. That's who I am. That's what I do. And if that embarrasses you, I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry that my life disappoints you, but I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Not anymore. Not for this wedding. Not for anything." She left my bedroom without another word. I was hanging the uniform back in the closet when I heard her phone notification sound from the hallway. A text message. She read it, and I heard her footsteps quicken as she moved down the stairs. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the next morning when I came down for breakfast, I noticed something strange. There were no invitations visible, no wedding materials scattered on the kitchen counter the way they had been during previous visits. No seating charts, no vendor confirmations, no mother of the groom notes about logistics. The planning documents had been carefully removed, and when I checked my phone, I found a text notification from my mother's number, sent at midnight the previous evening. It was a screenshot of a group conversation that included my mother, my father, and Thomas. The timestamp showed the exchange had taken place at 11:47 p.m., 43 minutes after our bedroom conversation had ended. My mother's message, sent first. "She insists on wearing the uniform. She won't listen to reason." My father's message, 5 minutes later, "Ellen, she's an adult. Let her make her own choice." My mother's response, immediate. "Her choice is to humiliate this family in front of the Ashfords. That's what her choice means." And then Thomas's message, which was the one that changed everything. "Don't worry. I have an idea. We can make sure she's not an issue at all." And that was the moment I understood that my exclusion hadn't been a spontaneous reaction to my refusal to comply. It had been planned from the very beginning. I read that message at 6:47 a.m. The kitchen was empty. The coffee maker was still cold. I stood there in my mother's house in my running clothes, reading my brother's words on my phone screen, and I felt my heart rate change in a way that had nothing to do with the 5 a.m. run I'd already completed. Make sure she's not an issue at all. Not talk to her, not convince her, not even exclude her if she won't listen. He was speaking about me like I was a logistical problem, like I was a piece of furniture that didn't fit the room, something to be relocated or removed entirely. I didn't respond to the text. I deleted it. I set my phone on the kitchen counter and I stood there for a long moment, listening to the refrigerator hum, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark time, listening to the sound of my own breathing becoming deliberate and controlled. This was the moment I should have been angry. This was the moment where someone might have thrown something, or called someone, or demanded an explanation. But I was trained in compartmentalization. I was trained in response time. I was trained to identify a problem and formulate a plan before emotion took over. So I made a decision. I went upstairs to my childhood bedroom, and I put on my dress uniform, every piece of it. The jacket with the captain's bars, the perfectly pressed trousers, the shoes polished to a mirror shine, the insignia in its correct position. I looked at myself in the mirror and I didn't recognize the person looking back, or rather, I recognized her for the first time in decades. I recognized her as someone who belonged to herself. When I came downstairs, my mother was in the kitchen. She was making breakfast, moving through her familiar routine, and when she looked up at me, she actually went pale. I watched the color drain from her face in real time. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" she said. "Getting ready for the wedding," I replied. My voice was level. "Isn't that what we're doing today?" "You can't wear that," she said, and now her voice had taken on a desperate quality. "Eleanor, we talked about this. You agreed?" "No," I interrupted her, and the word was delivered so quietly it almost disappeared. "You told me to change my clothes. I chose not to." That's not an agreement. That's you making a request and me declining it. She set down the spatula. I could see her hands trembling. Your brother will be humiliated, she said. Catherine's family will think we're... She didn't finish. She didn't need to. I knew exactly what she was afraid they would think. I'd always known. Maybe they'll think my family raised a daughter who's proud of her work, I said. Maybe they'll think that achievement matters regardless of what uniform it comes in, or maybe they'll think exactly what you're terrified they'll think. Either way, Mom, that's not my problem to solve anymore. My father came down a moment later. He was dressed already, wearing the suit he'd worn to events for the past 10 years. He looked at me, then at my mother, then at me again. Ellen, he said carefully, let her do this. It was the first time in 14 years I'd heard him say anything remotely close to defending me. It shouldn't have mattered. By that point, his voice was almost a stranger's. But I felt something shift in my chest anyway. Some part of me still wanted him to speak up. Some part of me was still waiting. My mother looked at him like he'd betrayed her. Don't, she said coldly. Don't do this. Not today. And I watched my father do what he'd always done. I watched him retreat. He picked up his coffee. He didn't meet my eyes. He found somewhere else to look. The newspaper, the weather through the window, anywhere except the moment in front of him. He was choosing her. Again, he was choosing her comfort over my integrity, and he would do it without ever having to look at what he was choosing. The wedding wasn't until 2 p.m. I had nearly 8 hours to change my mind. My mother spent 6 of them trying to convince me. She tried reasoning with me. She tried appealing to my sense of family loyalty. She tried crying, which was effective until I reminded myself that her tears were about her embarrassment, not about anything I had actually done wrong. She tried calling Thomas, which I didn't witness but heard through the closed bathroom door while she was on the phone, her voice rising and falling with desperation. And then, around 1 o'clock, she called me into the living room. She was sitting on the sofa with her hands folded in her lap, and her face had taken on the expression of someone who has decided to play a final card. I need you to understand something, she said quietly. If you wear that uniform, if you walk into that wedding as a military officer, then as far as I'm concerned, you are no longer my daughter. I'd known that threat was coming. I'd been waiting for it since I was 18 years old. I'd spent 14 years trying to prevent it with achievement and compromise and the endless work of making myself acceptable. And you know what I felt when she finally said it? Relief. Not because I was happy about it, but because I was finally released from the exhausting work of trying to be someone I was not. I was finally freed from the impossible task of disappearing myself enough to fit into her definition of acceptable. Okay, I said. It came out very quiet, very steady, very calm. Eleanor, I heard you, I said. I understand. I'm going to the wedding now. I stood up. I looked at the woman on the sofa, and I felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but some confusing mixture of both. I felt the weight of all those years, all those invisible hours of shrinking myself, all those conversations I never had, all those achievements I never mentioned, all those versions of Eleanor Hayes that I'd created just to make someone else feel safe. And I felt it release. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking right now. You're thinking she wouldn't actually go through with it. You're thinking that a mother, when cornered, would step back from that threat. You're thinking that blood relation means something fundamental, that there's some invisible force that would compel her to retract those words once she saw the reality of saying them. Trust me, I asked myself the same thing, but let me ask you this. Have you ever watched someone choose their fear over you? Have you ever seen that moment where they make the conscious decision that their comfort matters more than your dignity? Drop your answer in the comments, because I want to know how many of you have lived this exact moment, because I'm guessing I'm not alone in this. I wore my uniform to that wedding. I drove to the Ashford estate in my mother's car because I'd driven 800 miles in my own vehicle, and I wasn't leaving until I was ready. The sun was bright and clear, the kind of October afternoon that feels like it's been staged for a photograph. The estate rose up from the manicured grounds like something from another era entirely. Old money expressed in stone and architecture, and the kind of landscaping that required a permanent staff to maintain. I parked. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The uniform was sharp. The bars were exactly positioned. The insignia gleamed. I looked like someone who had earned the right to exist in her own body. I walked toward the entrance. The ceremony was already underway when I arrived. I slipped into the back row as quietly as possible, but I could see my mother's head snap around the moment I entered. She was sitting with the other family members, her hand gripping my father's arm so tightly his face had gone pale. The ceremony was beautiful. Thomas and Catherine exchanged vows that were genuine and vulnerable in ways I'd never expected from my brother. I watched Catherine's face as she made her promises, and I saw the kind of certainty there that comes from actually being seen and chosen. I watched my brother smile at her like she was the most important person in his world, like her happiness was his responsibility and his joy. It made me angry, actually, because I'd never expected him to value someone else that way. I'd never expected him to have that capacity. When it was time for the recession, I stood with the other guests and applauded. My mother sat rigidly in her pew. She did not applaud. She stared straight ahead like if she simply refused to acknowledge my presence, she could erase it. The reception was held on the estate grounds under a series of enormous white tents. Tables were arranged with a precision that suggested a professional event planner had involved themselves in every detail. Flowers in coordinated whites and golds, seating charts that positioned the most important people at the best tables. A head table where the wedding party would sit, and on that head table there were 5 chairs instead of 6. There was a space for Thomas, a space for Catherine, a space for the best man, a space for the maid of honor, and then the chairs simply jumped to the other side, leaving a notable gap where a 6th chair should have been. I understood immediately. There was no ambiguity about what was happening. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an oversight. My brother had literally removed my seat from the table. I stood at the entrance to the tent, and I felt something crystallize inside me. Not anger yet, just clarity. The understanding that there were certain people in my life who had made a conscious decision about how to treat me. And that decision had nothing to do with my worth and everything to do with their fear. I found a table in the middle of the room where I didn't know anyone. I sat down. An older couple at the table introduced themselves. They were distant Ashford relatives, and when they asked what I did, I told them. I told them I was a military pilot. I told them I was a captain in the U.S. Air Force. I told them about the aircraft I flew and the kind of training involved and the reality of the work. The woman, whose name was Margaret, leaned forward with genuine interest. "How extraordinary," she said. "My grandson is studying aeronautical engineering. Perhaps you could give him some advice about the military aviation path?" "Of course," I said. And I felt something that I hadn't expected to feel at that wedding. I felt like myself. My father came over during the cocktail hour. He found me standing near the bar, watching the crowd mingle and circulate. When he approached, he looked exhausted in a way I'd never quite noticed before. There were lines around his eyes that seemed to have deepened in the 8 hours since the morning. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was very small. "Your mother is very upset." "I know," I replied. "She says you promised not to wear the uniform," he continued, and I could see the conflict playing across his face, the desire to believe her version of events, the exhaustion of having to choose sides. "She says you made an agreement." "That's not what happened," I said calmly. "She asked me to wear a blue dress instead. I declined. She asked me to make myself invisible. I declined. She made a threat. I decided to let her follow through." My father was quiet for a long moment. "I should have defended you," he said finally. "This morning. I should have said something." "You should have," I agreed. "I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just stating a fact, but you didn't." He had no response to that. But he nodded once, like he was acknowledging something he'd always known to be true, and then he walked back toward the tables where my mother was sitting with her expression carefully arranged into something neutral and controlled. The dinner was served. The speeches began. Thomas spoke about Catherine with such tenderness that I felt something twist in my chest. My father gave a short toast that was pleasant and mostly unremarkable. The best man told embarrassing stories about Thomas that made everyone laugh. And then there was the moment for the wedding party to be seated. My brother stood at the head table and looked around. He looked at the empty chair next to the maid of honor. He looked at the room. And for just a moment, just a flash of a moment, he looked at me. I saw the recognition on his face. I saw him understand what he'd done, and I saw him turn away. I walked out past the strings of lights and the tables of dancing guests and the orchestra playing in the white tent, and I felt the October air cold against my face. It was a 40-minute drive back to my mother's house. I spent those 40 minutes thinking about all the ways this moment could have unfolded differently. I thought about my mother as a young woman, terrified of poverty and shame. I thought about my father as a young man. I folded my dress uniform carefully. I placed it back in the garment bag, and I touched the lavender sachet one more time before closing the closet door. My grandmother had placed that sachet there decades ago. She had wanted to protect something I loved. She had understood even back then that I would need something to believe in. I left a note on the kitchen counter. It was very short. "Thank you for teaching me what I will never accept again. Regards, Eleanor." I drove back to Cambridge without sleeping. The road was empty and dark, and by the time the sun came up, I was crossing back into Massachusetts. The bakery below my apartment smelled like fresh bread and butter and the promise of a new day. But I didn't go upstairs. Instead, I drove to the base. I had some calls to make.